Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These monthly briefings address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future employer briefings. I want to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will address how the historical 2020 election results will affect the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, congressional actions in the employment sphere, the corporate response to issues of inequality and diversity, and enforcement policies and actions by the agencies. The presenters are our FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Valerie, thank you very much, and greetings everyone, and to Nita and Bert, it's nice to see both of you again. Albeit virtually, and we're really delighted to join so many of you today in what is proving to be just ongoing, almost hourly momentous developments, and to see if we can recap and frame out what we're looking at with respect to workplace issues. Let me first just hit an initial preliminary matter. Valerie, we'll just jump to the next slide. I think as most of you know, FortneyScott, we are a law firm based in Washington, D.C. We do counsel and represent a wide range of employers before federal agencies dealing with many of the issues that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. Additionally, although the information we're providing today is being provided by 3 lawyers, and most of it does involve legal developments, of course, the purpose of today is for informational purposes, and you would be encouraged to understand how these developments may affect your company, your organization, by consulting with experienced employment counsel. Well, let's turn to the agenda because, gosh, we have had a lot. We've got a new president-elect, we think, many of us think. We have an upcoming Congress and a number of other developments. So we're going to try to spend the next 60 minutes recapping and focusing on what these changes mean for all of us as we deal with the workplace. First and foremost, even though the election is on the top of everyone's mind, honestly, COVID-19 continues to be the greatest challenge that our country faces. And we're going to get an update from that, and Nita will lead that. But then, of course, we're going to quickly turn to the Biden-Harris administration in the workplace, what those changes may be. We want to talk a little bit about Congress. Congress is also very interesting, and particularly the lame duck session, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. It's coming up. I want to talk briefly about business and diversity and what that may mean in this new environment. And of course, the federal agencies, because they do remain active. And there have been a number of developments, very recent developments that are significant that we want to share with you. But let's start first, as we always do, with the COVID-related developments. And Nita, unfortunately, the developments continue apace, don't they?
They are terrible. Thank you, Valerie. So look at this number. The number of cases in 2 weeks is up 59%. If you look, we are now at over 100, and we're averaging over 111,000 cases a day. And many of these are in the Midwest, especially the upper Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota. Utah, David, I think we discussed, has just put a mandatory mask requirement in. I checked on other states. Some of the states refused to put anything in, but South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and I have to tell you, I was so appalled on Saturday night when the kids at Notre Dame stormed the field in the middle of a pandemic. So They believe that a lot of this may have come from Halloween, which was about 2 weeks ago. And in fact, it's hit the White House again. You have Mark Meadows, who used to be the congressman of my home district in Asheville, and 5 others so far have tested positive, and they think it was out of the election party that was held, no social distancing and no masks. And so we are seeing, and while the deaths are not quite increasing as quickly, you still have a 14% increase in deaths, and there is a lagging indicator there. Some of the reporting is not as great as it could be. So I think, David, this is the issue which no one is really talking about, and how you stop it. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit. First and foremost, I think we can, President-elect Biden announced today a 13-person task force, all of whom are well recognized as experts. I'm just going to mention the 3 co-chairs: David Kessler, former FDA commissioner; Marcela Nunez-Smith, co-chair, Yale Associate Dean for Health Equality Research; and Vivek Murthy, co-chair, former Surgeon General of the United States. Those 3 are just the co-chairs. Biden has announced he's meeting with them today and will provide comments later today as to what their next steps will be. But of course, he's not president yet and won't be able to do anything until January 20th. So meanwhile, those places that have opened up are now, they just announced today in St. Louis County, where I live in St. Louis City, they're going to start shutting down restaurants again because of the surge here in Missouri. That impacts schools, that impacts employers. And while employees are trying to use some of the state laws to sue their employers, that basically is not working very well. So that's kind of where we are right now, and I think we're in COVID. Everyone's tired of COVID, but COVID isn't tired of us.
COVID's not tired of us, and it's clear that this, even though people are very focused, appropriately so, on the election, COVID is not taking a break, and the challenges that employers have had, particularly multi-state employers, are escalating. We are entering a period now that's worse than we've had throughout the pandemic to date. And all indications are this is only going to get worse in the next 30 to 60 days. So, you know, it's wonderful that President-elect Biden has a task force stood up and that is going to honor science and give it a much more dominant role. That's a sharp contrast to rallies where you're chanting to put Tony Fauci's head on a pike in front of the White House gate, and they would give science a more dominant role. But I think we all need to recognize that it is going to be a while, that what we are currently going through is going to continue for quite a while, even in the face of the very positive news on a potential vaccination that is coming out today. Once again, the effective rate when any of us on this call or even our healthcare providers, our frontline healthcare providers can benefit is still a matter of many weeks. And the rest of this calendar year is going to be rough, no matter how you slice it, really rough.
Indeed.
So I don't know on that. I mean, I think that I don't envision much new coming out of the administration vis-a-vis this. We're going to talk a little bit about whether there'll be some federal relief, but in terms of a different approach federally, whether there'll be coordinated mask wearing guidelines or anything, no. It's still going to be state by state, locality by locality. The example you give with Utah shows that even some of the so-called deep red, the Republican states that have been quite opposed to masks, their healthcare facilities are sufficiently overrun that they have no choice now but to begin to look at masks and some of the other approaches that have been recommended for a while. And I think that will become a bit of the new normal. But other than that, looks like more of the same for the foreseeable next couple of weeks at least, unfortunately. Well, shall we move from there to the other probably the headline that's covered everyone's attention more than anything. Bert, why don't you start us off on these developments, please?
Well, I'll be glad to. Whoops, we can stay back one more slide because the only poll that counts, we learned, is the one that the voters make. And what we saw last few days was an unprecedented outpouring of votes that elected Joe Biden, but it was an unusual vote. First off, it's historic. Very few incumbents in the history of the country have ever been displaced after a single term. But even more unusually, this president-elect had no coattails. In fact, he had reverse coattails. Losses in the House, Senate still in abeyance. This would be the first president in memory that did not come into a term with a Senate of the same party. So there are sharp divisions in the country, that's for sure, sharp divisions in Congress, and all of those will pose a challenge to everyone, including especially the president-elect and his party. So, and for a workplace view of it, the divisions in the country will probably be reflected in your workforce. And you have to start thinking now of how to tamp down the emotional temperature that has been raised to a fever pitch and is being fed still by the president who refuses to concede. So the next slide, please. We'll get to the Biden-Harris administration. I'd like to take a moment just to remind everyone that the second half of that Biden-Harris is really an historic moment. The first woman in our history to be in that position, a heartbeat away from the presidency, the first woman of color to be in that position, a heartbeat away from the presidency. And although, as David pointed out, this is the year of COVID and we can never get away from that, this fall has kind of been the fall for women and girls, the outpouring of affection for Justice Ginsburg, and now the presence of a woman vice president for, just imagine if you're a parent of a daughter, that they will look at role models that they have never seen before in their lives, and the dream of every child, thinking not just every boy, but every child can dream of being president of the United States, will be realized, at least in the imaginings of the majority of people in this country, the women of this country. So that's kind of what all of this implies. And now we'll talk about the nuts and bolts of,
Right.
the Biden-Harris workplace. And
so let's talk a little bit about what will begin to happen. So now we're leaping over and making a couple of assumptions that historically we wouldn't think we'd need to spend much time wondering about. You know, is the Electoral College going to recognize the vote 74 million to 70 million? Are these different votes in states going to hold up? We believe the answer to that is yes, and that President Biden will begin serving in approximately 6 weeks. And on January 20th. When he does, we know that the workplace is going to be one of the critical areas that will receive a wide focus. Now, of course, Bert mentioned that the Senate, I think we all recognize, is still unknown because we have at this point a 48 to 50, 48 Democrats and Independent, 50 Republican, and we have 2 open seats that we have to have a rerun on. Both of them happen to be in Georgia. And that's because each state controls its own requirements on voting. And if a candidate doesn't receive at least 50% of the vote, then you have to have a rerun. So that's going to happen for both seats. That will be a real Donnybrook coming up. But so we don't know, but this is a really important point. And it's one that I think we need to recognize as we look at what the Biden administration will be able to accomplish. Whether it controls the Senate or not is a critical question. As Bert points out, normally that does occur. So far has not yet occurred. Biden may pick that up. But if he doesn't, what does that mean? That means that it will temper the types of individuals who might be confirmed to positions. It means it will temper the type of legislation that will get enacted. It means it will temper and modify the budgets that will be imposed. And so many voters, anecdotally at least, are indicating they kind of like that divided government. They want a different head of the executive branch, but they may want that divided government to cross-check to that so-called left component, left socialist, using quotes around it, component of the Democratic Party. I don't know, and we will see how that works out. Here's what we do know, though, irrespective of how those Senate races work out, the President Biden, as the head of the executive branch, has a wide range of actions that he can take largely unilaterally. And of course, one of the biggest proponents of unilateral executive branch agency has been President Trump, who has in fact litigated and demonstrated the breadth of executive power. It's quite broad, broader than many people thought, honestly. But we have obviously executive orders, and as we'll just use President Trump's history as an example, they can touch a broad range of topics: immigration, trade, the workplace. All of those are fair game. That does not require congressional approval. It doesn't require regulations. It simply requires the executive to say, this is how it shall be, and it shall go forward immediately. Similarly, civil service protections, and these are all areas where we have seen the president impose significant, President Trump impose executive orders and changes that we think are likely to be effective. The executive order, the most recent one on diversity and inclusion training, 13950, early candidate to be rescinded. The president's signing of civil service protections affecting federal civil service protections, unionization rights, likely to be rolled back. Diversity training, that's the executive order 13950 for both the federal sector, the military, as well as all private federal contractors, likely to be pushed back. The changes on DACA and whether DACA rights will be respected, again, likely to be pulled back and returning back to how they were pre-Trump. Regulations do not require congressional approval. They do require notice and comment. However, there are instances where an agency can actually temporarily suspend regulations that it finds to be at odds, or temporarily impose new regulations. Think about OSHA. OSHA, we did not have a COVID standard. There is something called an emergency temporary standard that allows the regulation to be implemented immediately. And finally, changes in trade. President-elect Biden has announced on day one he will be returning to the Paris Accord and to the World Health Organization. So we think that trade and the international relations will change almost immediately, again, by executive fiat. But there will be more than those broad brush strokes. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the new policy leaders and some of the underlying policies. And Bert, maybe you can talk about that on the next slide, please.
Be glad to. I think one of the things we have to remember is that the president's most effective power is the power of appointment. There will be a completely new cabinet. Every cabinet department, every executive agency will have new personnel, and the new personnel will bring new policies. That is one of the most effective powers of the president. As David pointed out, the Supreme Court has expanded the authority of the president, and now President-elect Biden will be able to exercise that expanded authority. New personnel will bring new policies. In our particular sphere, we're going to have a new Secretary of Labor, a new solicitor. There will be new heads of OSHA, of Wage and Hour, of the OFCCP, of the EPA, all the way through the executive branch. And we have to remember what those new personnel will effect. Most significantly, it seems to us, we're going to get new policies, interim final regulations from OSHA. There's going to be a reexamination of the independent contractor and joint employer regulations from the Wage and Hour Division. There's going to be a new examination of exempt status. So all of these opinion letters that have come from Wage and Hour, it's hard to imagine, because so much has been changed over the last 4 years, how much of a change we're going to effect. Immigration, because of the number of unemployed still in the country, creates a really divisive challenge to the Democratic Party. They have never been able to articulate an immigration policy. And now, since they're in charge, it's going to have to be the ball is now in their court. As for legislation, I guess we have to wait for Georgia. But don't overlook what the changes in personnel can mean, because it's going to mean a turnaround in enforcement policies, in enforcement strategies. There are a number of pending cases, which we learned from the Trump administration can be withdrawn by the new administration. Legal positions can be turned on a dime. And I think we're going to see over the succeeding, after 74 days, we're going to see changes in the litigation strategies of a number of the enforcement policies, from the Department of Justice down to the Labor Department, down to the enforcement agencies. And I think in every case, it all comes back to the, pretty amazing authority of the president to appoint his agents in the cabinet and in the enforcement agencies. So please look for that, and look for a whole range of workplace opportunities that the Biden administration is going to seek change.
You know, one observation, Anita, I'll turn it over to you. One observation, because we have seen, although not identical, but we have seen a similar change when the Obama administration followed the Bush administration. And just as a point of privilege and overgeneralizing, but honestly, the Democrats were much better organized, much better efficient at running an agency, picking it up and saying, this is not going the way we want it. In contrast to when the Trump team came in. Now, part of it may have been they weren't necessarily expecting to come in.
Right. They did not expect to win. Right.
In contrast, the Biden team has a very deep org chart and depth player chart on every position. Most of the likely candidates are very experienced in running government agencies. They understand the wheels. They understand how to turn that. And honestly, they're not shy about saying, more so than the Republicans, you know what? That's what the prior administration did. That's no longer our policy or value. We're doing it differently. And I don't care whether they're pulling litigation, whether they're changing regulations, changing enforcement. There's no subtlety. It is where the ship direction is changing about 120 to 180 degrees, and it's changing right now. And I see within the first 90 days that happening very quickly. Yes, Bert.
I think we have to remember that the Democrats like government. They believe in government, and over the years they have proven that they're good at government. You are not going to see these regulatory disasters that greeted the Trump administration and continue to greet the Trump administration about how to do it right. The Democrats are really good at that, and they have really good bench strength on the following the Administrative Procedure Act, following all the regulatory hoops and circles. And I think we're going to see, if and when they do seek new regulations or try to amend and modify existing regulations, we're not going to see the kinds of tribulations that the Trump administration found in the courts. They're kind of good at this. This is what they like to do.
Nita?
Well, I will say one thing. There are two things that have changed since the Obama administration. One, Obama in his first 2 years had a Senate that was predominantly Democratic. And two, during the Trump administration, they have filled the courts with individuals that they consider to be conservative, and so they're going to be small government people. So, you may find one or two judges like we had in the Obama administration down in Texas or someplace else who are going to stop this. But generally, you're right. The Supreme Court has given the administration a great deal of latitude to do this. And somewhere in here, gentlemen, we have feedback, and I don't know why. But Valerie, let's go to the next slide, if you don't mind. So we've talked a little bit about what's going to happen in the executive branch, which is Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, and so forth. But you've also got the administrative agents, the independent agents, which are EEOC and NLRB. And interestingly, because of the Trump administration took so long to fill the EEOC, that unless we get a resignation by the current chair of the EEOC, they are not going to have a Democratic majority until July of 2022, which, as we saw in the Trump administration, when there was a Democratic majority for much of the Trump administration, it means that the Republicans couldn't get what they wanted through the EEOC, and the same will happen with the Democrats unless Chair Dillon decides that she doesn't want to be chair anymore, which does happen. I assume that once there's a majority of Democrats, you will find that the MOU that was just signed, and David, I don't know if we want to talk about that just briefly, MOU was signed between OFCCP, EEOC, and the Department of Justice, which was opposed strenuously by the Democrats on the EEOC. It was seen by the Democrats as a threat to the independence of the EEOC, where it appeared that Department of Justice would have more of a say in what litigation EEOC is involved with. But you will get a new general counsel, you'll have a new litigation strategy, and so we'll just have to see how quickly that occurs. The board, the National Labor Relations Board, again, you're not going to have a majority until August of 2021 at the earliest, and there's a possibility they won't have it till the end of 2021. But there's lots and lots of stuff. So at the EEOC, some of the things that are going to come up under Democratic administration are things like, are we going to renew Component 2, the pay data collection? EEOC was supposed to look at joint employer. Are they going to look at that or just drop it? Will they look at the reconciliation proposal? At the National Labor Relations Board, you will get a new general counsel, which may withdraw some of the litigation and proposals and memoranda, but you again are not going to have a voting majority until at least the summer coming up. David or Bert, anything else on these administrative agencies before we move on?
I just wanted to make one point quickly.
Well,
Bert, I'll go to you. With respect to these semi-independent, quasi-independent agencies, EEOC and the NLRB, although the chair is selected and serves at the pleasure of the president, that doesn't, to Nita's point, it doesn't mean that the board members or the commissioners changes. They're there for a fixed term. So you have this possibility, likely, that the Biden administration would pick one of the two Democratic chairs, Commissioner Samuels or Burrows, to become the acting chair, or perhaps even the chair. But they still would only have 2 Democratic votes and would have 3 Republican votes, and similarly on the NLRB. So the change isn't quite as immediate or impactful in terms of the leadership because there isn't the corresponding votes to change those policy directions. Bert.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that people forget the power of the General Counsel of the NLRB. The NLRB is essentially our first super agency, one of the leading planks of the New Deal. They were just finding out what to do. I doubt that they would ever create an NLRB in this shape today. The General Counsel is really the person who issues the litigation strategy, who picks the cases to go forward, who issues memoranda concerning what the positions of the board may or may not be. And we will have a new general counsel who will rescind many of General Counsel Rob's pro-business, anti-organization memoranda and positions. So even though the membership of the board will not change for many, many months, perhaps even a year, there will be significant changes in the litigation strategies and litigation positions of the NLRB. Please, Nita.
I was just going to mention, I wanted to mention that there's actually only one Democrat on the NLRB at present. They did not nominate, they had a nominee that was Congress, the Senate wouldn't approve. So we have 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. So that might give a little bit of leverage, but still you're going to have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, at least until the summer. David?
Correct. And you can get a sense, again, this goes back to who controls the Senate as to the type of individual, the policy direction that the individuals may pursue based on the kind of the stranglehold that the Senate may or may not have on confirmations. Well, let's talk about the next slide, a little bit about the regulations. Nita, did you have something?
I was just going to follow up with, it's important to remember, especially even if the Democrats get the Senate, it's going to be a very close, and I think Vice President-elect will have to be the deciding vote, which means that some more radical, especially union organizers who might be put on in some of these positions are going to have a very hard time getting through the Senate. So I think that's something, as you mentioned, just to reinforce that. Sorry, go ahead.
All right. Well, let's talk briefly about which regulations, and we've touched on this. And there again, the executive agencies have a wide range of authority. Of course, once a regulation has been properly promulgated, you have to, under the Administrative Procedure Act, go through a notice period, give people a chance to comment, put people on notice, give a rationale to rescind it. Most of these regulations aren't going to simply be rolled back. They would be rescinded and replaced. So you have to work up the replacement provision. So normally it would be we're going to rescind, and here's what the new regulation is. Even on a fast track, that takes conservatively a year for any major regulation, and that's viewed as lightning speed, and it can take longer than that. That's why some of the major regulations that the Labor Department's been working on are just now getting finished, and they've had total control over the schedule to work on these for 3 years. The joint employer, that regulation is currently being litigated. Gig worker, independent contractor, very important regulation. One that we have not seen that we anticipate, it is pending approval in the White House, which is the final stage of issuing a final regulation, is OFCCP's religious freedom in the workplace. And it was, at least as proposed, one that would amplify and expand religious rights and that are sometimes in tension with other EEO protections. And so how those play out is important. But then beyond the regulations, there is a whole bunch of sub-regulatory guidance. And this is important. It is important because we can rely on it. It represents what the agencies are supposed to be doing and tend to do. And in that regard, there are a wide range of guidances, opinion letters, everything that's out there. In contrast to those regulations, this sub-regulatory guidance, opinion letters, et cetera, those can simply be rescinded. They are the stroke of the pen. They don't require notice and comment. You simply put a notice in the Federal Register and you put it on the agency website. Please be advised that the following opinion letters are rescinded effective immediately. Boom. And the same would hold true with all of the sub-regulatory guidance, which is why sub-regulatory guidance is easy to do and easy to rescind or modify. Rulemaking, much more difficult to do, much harder to change. Yes, Bert.
Yeah. I don't like to point out it's not merely a matter of rescission. Certainly in the areas of OSHA and CDC, those two agencies with respect to the COVID resurgence can act affirmatively. We can get interim final regulations from OSHA, which have immediate effect, and the CDC is empowered on the Public Authority Act to issue emergency mandates, which are enforceable just as if they were a regulation. So although there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of work at Wage and Hour and OFCCP regarding religious freedom and independent contractor, affirmative steps can be immediately taken by these sub-regulatory contexts that have the effect of regulation.
Well, and I want to double down because OSHA has not issued a COVID standard.
Correct.
That has been the source of extensive litigation challenges by the AFL-CIO and other interest groups. The incoming Biden administration has said unequivocally it will implement an emergency temporary standard. What that means as a practical matter, there will be a regulation that governs every employer in the United States likely by February 1st with respect to COVID. That you can count on.
Right.
That is going to happen. It will include record keeping. It will include whether you wear masks, a number of workplace protocols and protections. All right, Bert, and then we'll go to Nita.
Yeah, the final point is the independent contractor and the religious freedom memoranda and opinion letters. These are the hottest potatoes in the workplace, maybe in the country, and the success with which the administration will be able to effectuate a change depends greatly on Congress and greatly on the Supreme Court. We just had a case last week,
right,
challenging the rights of a law of general application and whether there can be an exception under the religious freedom concept. So stay tuned.
Well, Nita, Bert mentions the law.
Please.
Let's talk about what that might look like and whether President-elect Biden, when he's in the role as president, will be successful in reaching across the aisle.
Well, I'm going to do this quickly because we've still got a bunch to cover. But I think the bottom line is that the more much of what the progressives would like to pass, I think is going to be very difficult. They lost seats in the House. And I think largely because of the progressive wing and how they were able to characterize them. And also the Senate, even if they have the Senate, it's only going to be by 1 or 2 votes at the most. So, but I will say, and all of these, I mean, it's going to be interesting. We have the Supreme Court hearing oral argument on the ACA, I think this week, I believe it is like coming up. And the
tomorrow.
PRO Act, which is the unions will push for very hard. Thank you, Bert. But I will say this, universal health, universal child care or paid leave and minimum wage, those passed in states that voted for Trump. So I believe there are ways that the Democrats can get some of these things passed, because I think what we're seeing is that people are they're certainly more interested in some of these laws, $15 minimum wage and that kind of thing. And I think that goes across both Democrats and Republicans. Some of the more traditional Democratic views, I think, are not going to be passed unless they get a much bigger majority in the House and Senate. And that's my thought.
I would just add, I agree with you, paid leave most likely candidate. Infrastructure is likely to garner support. The PRO Act, which would be a radical reformation of union organizing, unlike anything we've seen in 75 years. Because the blue wave did not materialize, the chances of that have decreased now significantly, but have not been eliminated.
Right.
All right. Well, Nita, let's keep moving.
Okay. Well, let's go to what we're going to do during the lame duck session. And beginning with, and I believe this is, I think this is Bert to talk about the COVID relief, which is his favorite subject.
Yeah, it's lame ducks have been chaotic in the past in every administration, and with the lack of a concession and continuing opposition from President Trump, this will probably be a chaotic session as well. First on the list, however, is whether we can expect a limited COVID relief bill that each party will agree to. There have already been articles that they're fighting about it already. Do you want to give Biden a better chance of generating a better economy? Do you want to, as they did with Obama, make him a one-term president? Oddly enough, the way these things work and intertwine, if we get effective OSHA regulations, the possibility of a liability safe harbor increases, because all those provisions were cued to you can get a safe harbor if you follow regulations. And frankly, since there haven't been regulations, there has been no chance for this bill. So if that hurdle is passed, the Congress will then be fighting about how much. Will you include state and local government funding? Will you include school funding? It's really a matter of how much of a bill can pass. The tightness of the election, I think, strengthens Senator McConnell's position, but it will have to be seen. one thing we know for sure, we have 74 more days, and Congress is not going to stop. Other confirmations, including judicial confirmations, will continue. There have been a number that have been pending for months, which now finally, if there is a COVID relief bill and there is no election to distract our legislators, we will have more confirmations and more activity across the board. But one thing for sure, this is not going to be a calm transition time. The history of past lame duck sessions indicates they are normally chaotic, and this one promises to be even more chaotic. David, I think you have some thoughts on whether and to what degree we're going to get a budget, which we have
Sure.
to have by December 11th.
I'll very quickly. We're under continuing resolution government-wide. That expires December 11th. Not only do we have a lame duck Congress, we have a lame duck president. And so what budget? A budget requires not only Congress to cooperate and reach agreement, it requires the president, unless there's going to be a veto override, which is very unlikely. So how this will play out, we don't know. One of the critical things that is going to come into play, it does effectively dictate the priorities to some degree, at least for the first year of the new administration. So I think that this is something, the next 2 to 3 weeks in the Congress, forget the counting the votes and worrying about who is formally going to be voted. There is going to be hand-to-hand combat going on in Washington, D.C. All right, Nita.
Right. One last thing before we go to the next topic. We currently have 66 federal judiciary openings, vacancies. Yep. They have 41 nominees at present. I expect not only will they fill as many of those as possible, but they may try to force some older Court of Appeals judges out to fill those as well.
You're going to see the land speed record on judicial confirmations by Senator McConnell. I agree. All right, let's go to Black Lives Matter. Nita, can you kick us off on that, please?
I can. I think that the most important thing to know about this is that 91% of African American women voted for Joe Biden. And if that many, and a majority by far of African Americans voted for Joe Biden, and I think the Democrats are going to owe them. And one of the things that I expect is that this lovely 13,950 that we've been fretting about will go away. I expect that will go away before the end of January, I believe. And I think you're going to see a reinforcement of EEOC and OFCCP, and maybe more requirements placed on federal contractors, more like diversity and inclusion goals and that type of thing. And David, I think, I just saw today my beloved University of North Carolina lawsuit on affirmative action is going to trial. I think you may see the Department of Justice changing sides and supporting the universities, Harvard, Yale, Carolina, who have all been focused on as places where they are not following the affirmative action rules.
Yeah. I think that this is an area where we're going to see radical, rather immediate changes. Okay, well, Bert, let's spend a little bit of time on the agencies because it is Washington, and they don't seem to sleep even while all these other developments are swirling around. The agencies do continue.
Isn't that the truth? If you go to the next slide, we'll get some sense of where we're heading. As I said before, lame duck periods are periods of chaotic transition. The examples of prior administrations, Republican or Democrat, is not encouraging. You may like the outcomes, but the process has been wrenching. We get midnight regulations, that is to say regulations that are issued that reach the final stage in the last weeks and days of an administration. We get lawsuits and enforcement actions filed in late December between Christmas and New Year, between Christmas and Inauguration Day. We have the so-called burrowing in, where you have political appointees finding civil service positions. We have irreversible changes. There could be many from President Trump in foreign policy, where he has, he speaks with complete authority with respect to troops in Iran, troops in Afghanistan, appointments of military personnel, promotions, denial of promotions, postings. We already know that some of the things that happen at the USPS are irreversible in the sense of where those machines are, where those letter boxes are. There will certainly be, it's already started yesterday with the demotion of the deputy administrator at FERC because he was trying to promote some climate change advancements. So we're going to see some radical changes in personnel, leaving some completely empty benches for bench strength, which may be for President-elect Biden an opportunity to even fill even deeper into the ranks. But I would say that over the next 75 days, 74 days, no matter what you expected, it's going to happen and more. And we don't exactly know the complete areas where all these changes or opportunities may be taken. But it looks as if the agencies are going to be extremely busy in trying to effectuate the final steps of the Trump administration's goals.
David, I think you're on mute.
Whoop.
Sorry about that. How about that? There we go. Sorry. This is sort of
That's perfect.
The same coin that we talked about. In other words, the same authority that the agencies have in the Biden administration to act unilaterally, that same authority exists for the next 6 weeks during the lame duck presidency.
Correct.
And indeed, there's arguably even fewer guardrails or accountability or ability to oversee or complain. I mean, it's very hard to have a congressional oversight hearing when Congress is going out. It's very hard as the holidays come forward. And there remain people that are bitter, that felt they may have had another 4 years to try to implement some of these very fundamental changes. And so it is possible that these sorts of things may occur in very significant ways. The only thing we need to keep sight of is, of course, those then could presumably be modified or changed by the subsequent administration. So, Nita.
Absolutely.
I was just going to mention 2 of the Obama last-minute enforcements in January of 2016 just resolved themselves. That would be the Oracle litigation, as well as J.P. Morgan finally settled their lawsuit as well. And that took till 2020 to resolve that.
Right. Those were filed in the last 72 hours of that administration. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the other agencies specifically. Nita, do you want to talk, update us on OFC?
Yeah. Sure. OFCCP has been incredibly busy here right at the end. They issued today, we saw it actually, they issued it actually Thursday of last week, but published in the Federal Register today is the final rule on non-discrimination and how they're going to interpret the very technical, how they're, 2 standard deviations and so forth on how they're going to find discrimination. It'll be interesting because it's a regulation, as we talked about earlier, not guidance, so it can't be overturned quickly. As Bert mentioned, the religious freedom regulations, which are very, very broad, have been sent to OMB. I think we can expect those to be finalized as well. It'll be interesting to see if they're as broad as they were initially. OFCC just issued, now this is sub-regulatory guidance, but technical assistance guidance for supply and service contractors, that just came out. And on Thursday, the verification proposal, and this is a proposal, this is not final yet, but those comments are due on Thursday. And so the final thing, and David, I'm going to turn to you on this, is we saw that the Inspector General of the Department of Labor is investigating OFCCP's enforcement of our favorite executive order 13950. Do we know whether it's because they're over enforcing it or under enforcing it?
Right. The truth is we don't know. And the IG, first of all, I will say when you're in an agency, having the Inspector General tell you that they're opening an investigation is never a good day at the office, okay? It takes a lot of time and energy. But we do not, the truth is we don't know if the IG on his own initiative, because the IGs are independent of the agencies that they monitor. They're the watchdog, if you will. and they can respond both to complaints, but they can also launch investigations on their own initiative. So 13950, which is the new diversity and inclusion training, outlawing, prohibiting white fragility training and other topics. Is it because it feels that the Labor Department's being overzealous and overriding other rights? Or is it because the Labor Department isn't being aggressive enough in monitoring and implementing those changes? Honestly, we just don't know. The IG publicly in a very vanilla letter just said, we're investigating, but we don't know what. So stay tuned on that. Yes, Bert.
Yeah. The only thing I'd point out is that the IG's letter followed less than a week after the formal lawsuit was filed by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and others challenging the the executive order on constitutional grounds, on the grounds that its language was void for vagueness and that it was an improper prior restraint of private speech by the government, which are very potent charges. So there's a lot of debate on the inside baseball world of the Administrative Procedure Act folks like me about just what's going on with this executive order and how it's going to be played out, and where the IG, which is out of left field, where the IG's commitment is going to follow.
Good. all right, well, Bert, while you're talking, let's go on and talk a little bit about some of the other agencies and what they're doing in this
yes,
lame duck
indeed.
period.
Again, Nita touched on the MOU, but just to explain it a little further, you might recall last year, in a very surprise action, the Department of Justice opposed a position of the EEOC formally in court. It was on the LGBTQ rights, and I think that rankled the Justice Department to this day. And the MOU, no matter how you want to talk about it, is a diffusion of the authority of the EEOC to be the sole and central investigator of Title VII violations. The MOU, as I say, diffuses that authority to the OFCCP without giving the OFCCP additional staff to investigate individual charges. And I think the ultimate effort of the MOU is to have a single legal position for the administration, including independent agencies, dictated by the Justice Department. Whether that is possible under the enabling legislation for the EEOC remains to be seen, but that is really the thrust of that MOU. To move on to religious freedom, I think there may not be time for the Trump administration and for the Trump-appointed and the Trump-dominated EEOC to come up with formal guidance on religious freedom, because the majority of the board will continue to be Republican for a significantly long period of time. It remains to be seen what they will be able to do with respect to new expansion of religious rights in the workplace and elsewhere under the guise of Title VII and under RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Rights Act. So those are things that we have to look forward to. There's going to be a second public hearing, and the first one was like a heavyweight championship boxing match. It was
Yes.
worse than that. It was bare-knuckled. So the second one may even be more bare-knuckled. This is a hotly debated issue. Behind the scenes, but not very behind the scenes, of course, is the Supreme Court, which has taken a very strong position that religious rights may be preeminent among the rights protected by the Constitution. The membership of the board Nita touched on before. Although there will be a new Democratic chair, it remains to be seen whether Chairman Dillon, a Republican appointee, will remain on the board. The tradition has been that the chair resigns when the parties change. That was not observed 4 years ago. Chairman Yang stayed on for several months, I think all the way into August. That may be the pattern for Chairman Dillon, or it may not, but that is her decision entirely to be made. So there's going to be a lot of activity at the EEOC. Those of you who care about Title VII rights, LGBT rights, and religious rights should keep an eye peeled and an ear peeled to the actions of the EEOC, both during the lame duck period and certainly through the first months of the Biden administration.
2 points.
Very important time.
2 points to add on this. Number one, in this MOU that has now been approved and put in place, the federal contractors face much more expansive investigations of individual charges by both the Labor Department and the EEOC. There's much more robust, and there's a much greater role for OFCCP to play in investigations, whereas historically EEOCs had more of that role. Please be attentive to that if you're a federal contractor. Number two, even if the chair changes, that President Biden appoints a new chair, the new chair for a period of time does not have the votes to change any of this.
And a majority.
So the majority will continue to be the Republicans, so there will continue to be a rush by the current chair and the Republican majority to solidify as much of this, because it effectively will remain there for 6-10 months so after the new administration. Okay, well, let's move on to a couple of other agencies that are also still moving in high gear. The joint employer rule is currently being litigated. We've talked about that. The Labor Department lost a judicial challenge to that rule. It is taking an appeal. It is keeping the litigation going to try to hold on to the rule that it spent over 3 years putting in place. There continues to be new opinion letters, and I would highlight these for you. Opinion letters are entitled to judicial deference under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So if you rely on the opinion letter, even if it's later withdrawn for the period of time it was on the books and you relied on it, you have a defense as a matter of law. It is a legal safe harbor. Note the one opinion letter, particularly those on voluntary training programs. Are they compensable, yes or no? That is an important opinion letter. We do expect additional opinion letters to be issued. We do not expect a repeat of what occurred in the Obama administration, where they waited till January 19th or something to issue opinion letters. I'm sorry, the Bush administration, when the Obama team came in, and many of those were summarily rescinded. Let's quickly turn to the next slide. I want to touch also on OSHA. We've indicated that although OSHA has not issued a standard, that we do expect that in the Biden administration. OSHA has recently summarized what its violations has found under the general duty clause. There are a number of them, 179 inspections, $2.5 million. You have the list of what the obligations are. OSHA continues to promulgate industry-specific guidance. Anyone that's involved with nursing home, healthcare facilities, last week OSHA promulgated, again, very detailed guidance for those industries, particularly on the use of respirators and face coverings, N95 masks, and other very detailed requirements. So OSHA, many of you may have been skating along, not paying much attention to OSHA. I predict after February 1st, you'll be paying much more attention to OSHA. It's going to dominate your workplace in the new administration. All right, well, let's talk about, we've covered a lot of ground. We have a minute or two, a couple of takeaways. And Nita, I'll let you go first, please.
Well, I think the resurgence of COVID is just number one on the hit parade. I realize we just had a very contentious election, which a majority of people think is over, but other people don't. But I think I apologize, we have sirens going up in St. Louis City here. Anyway, the COVID resurgence is number one, because if it closes schools, it's going to affect employers. And one thing I just wanted to mention, Bert and David, is this particular round, COVID has impacted the hiring of women more than anything we've seen in years, because they either can't work from home because the kids are there, or they have jobs where the kids are at home and they can't work. And it is devastating the ability of women to work.
Bert?
True. Well, we've already talked about the critical agenda for the lame duck Congress. First is whether we're going to get a COVID relief bill, which would have regardless of what it is, it'll have a significant impact on the economic recovery if there is one. It'll work in tandem with how you deal with the expansion of COVID, there are a number of other things on the agenda, including particularly judicial confirmations and the other confirmations that have been pending for months and months now. Chaotic period.
With respect to the transition period, I would encourage those that want to know, I mean, we have a lame duck Congress, we have a lame duck president, but we do have a sense as to what the Biden administration is likely to provide for us. If you go to the website, they've posted the website Build Back, which they are now populating almost by the hour, new initiatives, what they intend to do, but there's very specific, there's not a mystery as to what the Biden administration is going to do. There's great transparency. They're posting it on the website. They're committing. They have an action item on day one. Nita has explained that COVID is going to be the #1 priority, but it's not the only priority. And there's a number of others, including racial equality is a dominant, it's one of 4 primary pillars for the incoming administration. So many of the issues that we focus on are going to be dead center, spot on to what this new administration will worry about. So, Nita, I think right
we've talked extensively
on the timeline. And
yeah, I think we talked.
We should,
yep.
Right. Tell folks goodbye. Thank you again. Next slide, please. We will be meeting again on December 7th. Hopefully some of the uncertainty relating to the election will be resolved. We, at that time, will be focusing much more not only on what's going to happen this month, but really starting to lock in on what the new administration will be doing with greater specificity, so all of us can begin planning for the new changes that are about to occur. All right. Well, thank you all very much for today. Valerie, do you want to take us out, please?
Thank you, folks.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings, and you may view this briefing as well as our previous COVID-19 weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. The next monthly briefing will be December 7th. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.